Ellsworth Miller Lecture. I'd like to welcome Erno Bonebakker, who's going to be presenting on World War II in Casco Bay. Just a few things first. On the Zoom page, if you go to your lower right, it says reactions. That is where you will find the option to raise your hand. They've changed it. But we ask that you save all your questions until the end of Erno's presentation. Also, all of our lectures, of course, are recorded, so please be aware of that. And they are available at the shebighistory.com website. Our lectures are free to all those who'd like to join us, but there is a button for donating on our website if you are so moved. So thank you again for joining us, and I now turn this over to Erno. Done.
Thank you, Mary, for that introduction. I'm looking forward to sharing with lots of friends here. And let me share my screen. Here we go. The topic tonight is World War II in Casco Bay. The tagline is Facts and Myths, Images and Anecdotes. First, I want a few acknowledgements. I want to thank Cap Leonard for endowing this lecture series and suggesting that I give this talk. I also thank the Historical Society for handling the details. I've put them through their paces in the last 24 hours.
We've learned a lot.
I grew up in the shadow of World War II. Throughout my life, I have used local history to connect with place. This presentation is a product of that impulse. I'm new to Maine. We moved here in 1988, and we first came to Shebig in 94. In the process, I came across several mentors. The first one is Joel Eastman, retired professor of history at USM, and then Jim Millinger, former resident of Shebig and now a resident of Topsom. And more recently, I've enjoyed Cap Leonard's inspiration as well. As Mary said, if you will ask any questions that come to mind in the chat, we will review that at the end. But I ask that everybody hold all their questions until the end so that I don't get distracted and bungle this presentation. First, the facts about Casco Bay and World War II. Casco Bay was a strategic harbor for the US. It was one of only 17 that was protected by the Army Coast Artillery. And what its importance was that on the first case, it was the nerve center for administration and training of convoy escorts in the Atlantic. It was the base for Commander Destroyers Atlantic, or in Navy speak, Com Des Lant. He was based on a destroyer tender, which we will see later. It was also the Portland Naval Station was the headquarters for the US Navy's defense of the Maine coast during the war. Finally, Greater Portland was a war production center, most notably the South Portland shipyards, which were built, the first one was built before we got involved with the war and built 266 freighters during the course of the war. The myths, which I hope nobody will imprint on this, but very quickly on the lower right, one of the myths is that Casco Bay was the home of the North Atlantic Fleet, and this myth is perpetuated on a information panel at Fort Williams. After we finish this talk, I finish with this talk, I might try and get them to change it, but it'll undoubtedly be expensive. That information panel happens to be on the site of the World War II Harbor Entrance Control Post. Lots of warships visited Casco Bay, but it was not the home of the fleet. Actually, there was no single home of the Atlantic Fleet. And during most of the war, the admiral commanding the Atlantic Fleet wandered around the East Coast in a converted yacht, which he used as his headquarters. The other myth is that Casco Bay was a convoy assembly point. The as I mentioned, the South Portland yards built many freighters. There was a lot of traffic in and out of Casco Bay, but the convoys, both convoys moving all over the world, assembled elsewhere. I'm going to go back here so that you don't imprint on that myth as fact. Some background to World War II in Casco Bay. When the war started in September of 1939, it truly brought an end to the extended pain of the economic pain of the Depression. Beginning that the war started in Europe, the military in Casco Bay began preparing for war, and employment picked up with defense contracts for both the United States government and particularly our British allies. The East Shipyard in South Portland, which is now the Spring Point Marina, was built by the Brits. Starting in 1939, the United States had first tended towards remaining aloof from the events on the far side of the Atlantic and the Pacific, but it was gradually drawn into the global war and plunged into the war by Pearl Harbor, which resulted virtually overnight with the nation uniting to defend and mobilize to win the war on both the Atlantic and the Pacific fronts. The initial fears of invasion or attack moved rather quickly to an increasing focus on taking the war to the enemy, first against Germany and then against Japan. How did Casco Bay contribute to the war effort, and how was it impacted by the war? The defense of the bay was shared between the Army and Navy. This diagram, this annotated chart, which was originally shown in the 2008 Historical Society exhibit on World War II in Casco Bay, details the Navy's activity. The Navy patrolled the waters and the approaches and the entrance to Casco Bay. They had installed a magnetic loop which detected approaching vessels that extended from Cape Elizabeth, near the lobster shack in Cape Elizabeth, to Bailey Island. The Navy also maintained sonobuoys, minefields. In cooperation with the Army, they controlled entrance and exit to Casco Bay. The Navy maintained the gates, which blocked all the entrances to Casco Bay. The main ship channel that you see here had a gate in it for civilian traffic. Between Cushing Island and Peaks Island, there was a fixed gate net. Across Hussey Sound between Peaks and Long Island was a gate with a net with a gate that was exclusively for war vessels. Deer Point Passage was closed permanently, and the passage between Little John and Shebig had a set of obstructions across the sandbar with a net in the deep water where near Little John. And finally, there was a fixed net where the Cousins Island Bridge is. A lot of equipment, a lot of effort. And the other thing that isn't shown here is that the Navy regularly swept the channels to protect against mines that might have been laid by U-boats. The headquarters for this local defense effort was in the old post office at the corner of Middle and Exchange Street in the old port in Portland. The Army built upon a legacy of coast defense forts and installations going back to before the War of 1812. This diagram shows the complexity, and if you look at the upper center, you can see that even Shebig, which had a rather small detachment and only a few weapons, has 4 separate elements in it on Shebig. The Army's installations included shore batteries, shoreline defense, controlled mines, surveillance, which included radar and the many fire control and observation towers scattered across up and down the coast, as well as air defense. The Portland Harbor defenses extended from Fort Popham near Fort Baldwin near Popham Beach all the way down to Cape Porpoise. Was all of this effort necessary? It's easy to ask that question, but consider comparing local defense to pandemic planning and response, the maintenance of a fire and rescue department, and during the Cold War, the Strategic Air Command. In retrospect, I think we can all agree that those things were necessary. The risk of an attack on Casco Bay in 1940, after Germany invaded Western Europe, felt pretty likely. And that was carried out in early 1942 when the U-boats sank many, many ships on the East Coast. And during the course of the war, they landed spies and saboteurs, including a landing in Maine in 1944. However, by 1943, after the invasion of North Africa, the risk ebbed, with the Allies taking the battle against the Germans to Europe. The Army left a lot of concrete around the bay, but the Navy was mostly afloat and left few traces. I'm going to focus on the Navy, both because of my personal interest and to share some interesting photos drawn from many sources, ranging from Shebig attics to the Navy Department Library in DC. In terms of impacts of the war on island life, this is a diagram published by the military in the spring of 1942, showing the areas forbidden to civilian traffic, which includes most of the bay, Hussey Sound, and civilian traffic is limited and to passing in these narrow boat lanes around the edges of the bay. Because of the net across Deer Point Passage, ferries traffic to and from the ferry landing, which was at Western Landing in Coleman Cove near the Cox Chapman's house, had to go all the way down through the gate at near Little John Island and all the way around the island to the western landing. When this limitation was imposed, the Bay Lines announced they were only going to run one trip a day, and that made it impossible for somebody to go from Chesapeake to Portland and return in the same day, which had an enormous impact. In addition, all boats had to be registered. They had to have numbers on them. They had to fly certain flags, and everybody on the boat, operating a boat, had to have an official ID. There was a lot of changes. Now, going to the Navy activities in Casco Bay, this is a overview of the principal activities, both the local defense activities and the activities that supported the commander destroyers Atlantic and all of the warships. The headquarters, as I mentioned, was in the old post office that is now a park in the old port at Exchange and Middle Street. The Navy supply storehouse was on the state pier where Casco Bay Lines docks now, and the engineering base was right next to where Becky's is now. Comdes Lance flagship was moored to a buoy located between Waits Landing and Falmouth here and Great Diamond Island. It was convenient to the officers club that was in a mansion on very near Waits Landing. Long Island had a huge fuel dump in addition to a boat pool for small boats and training facilities for the Navy, which also were on Great Diamond on the Falmouth shore of Great Diamond. Little Chesapeake, the closest the Navy got to actually being on Chesapeake, was the site of the Fleet Recreation Center where sailors could get fresh air and exercise, as well as a shipboard firefighting trainer, which is one of the very few relics of the Navy in World War II. That's the rusty building on the beach facing Deer Point. I'd mentioned the Harbor Entrance Control Post, which was in Fort Williams, off the picture to the right. This is the old post office, which is the Navy headquarters. It's now a park at the corner of Middle and Exchange Streets. It was built in 1868 because after the Great Portland Fire of 1866, the federal government wanted to do something to help Portland rebuild. So they took a building that had been designed to be built in the South with a marble facade and dropped it into Portland, lock, stock, and barrel. Marble doesn't wear well in our northern climate. The building weathered badly, probably exacerbated by the coal smoke that permeated our cities in the end of the 19th century. The deteriorated building was demolished in 1965. Going now to the Harbor Entrance Control Post. This photo is taken from the site of the Harbor Entrance Control Post, which is, you see the roof of it at the lower left corner and lower right corner of the photo. And in front of the building, there's a sailor working a signal light for communicating with ships in offshore, as well as a searchlight, which was used to identify ships during the nighttime. This is a photo of the interior of the lookout station at the control post. On the left, we see a Navy officer scanning the horizon, and on the right, we see a Army soldier operating a searchlight control machine that allowed him to illuminate vessels and other things during the nighttime. The harbor entrance control post was operated 24/7 from September 1941 through the spring of 1945. They maintained a radio and visual watch. There was an Army, they always had an Army officer and a Navy officer on watch, and they challenged all vessels approaching and leaving Casco Bay using this searchlight, an examination vessel, and an alert gun battery for those who didn't pay attention. It's really quite a spectacular sight. As mentioned, they also maintained a plot of all vessels active in Casco Bay, which is shown here with the Navy and Army duty officers. Each vessel that was active had its own pin, and you can see all these pins in the bay. The columns of pins stacked up in the left are for the vessels that are not currently active in the bay. Commander Destroyers Atlantic, as I mentioned, was based on a flagship, which was a destroyer tender, which we see in the upper left. This was both a floating office, communication center, as well as a floating repair shop and supply facility that took care of all of the convoy escorts that it was responsible for. The picture in the upper right is a picture, a surreptitious snapshot taken from, I'm not sure where, but Chris Dowdy gave it to me, and it shows the Denebula anchored over near the Falmouth shore. The bottom picture is is another surreptitious shot, probably taken before the war, because they're not only civilian vessels out in the bay. The Coast Guard cutter in the right foreground is not painted wartime gray yet. And in the distance, we can see a 4-stack Navy destroyer at anchor. These snapshots are among the very few photos that I've seen in many years of studying this topic that show warships in the bay during the course of the war. This is a shot of 3 destroyer escorts late in the war off the Long Island shore. They're nested together and moored to a buoy, which you can see at the left. These are 2 more photos that Chris Dowdy gave me. On the left is the heavy cruiser Augusta, and probably, I can't identify it for sure. On the right is probably the heavy cruiser Tuscaloosa, taken before the war, again, because there's a civilian vessel in the snapshot. both of these warships spent most of the war in the Atlantic and stopped in Casco Bay many times. Now going to Long Island. This is a post-war photo of the Long Island shore. The tank farm had a number of subterranean underground tanks that were excavated out of the bedrock of Long Island in this area that I'm marking in the center of the photo. The rock that had been excavated was used to extend the shore of Long Island, as shown here. The boat pool was in this area with this shorter pier, and the two upper piers were the fuel piers that provided berthing for the fuel, the tankers and the warships that were drawing fuel. This building here, keep that in mind because we're going to see more of it. This is a photo from the collection I found in the Navy Library. The boat repair shop, which I called attention to in the last photo, is in the foreground. The boat basin is just off the picture to the left. Notice this warship on berth here, the three destroyer escorts we saw a minute ago out here, a number of tankers, small tankers used to fuel vessels in the anchorage, as well as a larger tanker. And we have a submarine right here on the fuel dock. This is a quick snapshot I took this summer showing that boat repair building that's still being used. I think it's being used by the town of Long Island. Here is a picture of the submarine. This is an Italian submarine. They named Vortice or Vortis. And she came over from Italy in 1944 after Italy had switched sides in the war and was used to assist in the training of convoy escorts, practicing anti-submarine attacks and tactics. This is a close-up of the Vortice. People are looking pretty comfortable. Here's a sailor, presumably an Italian sailor, sunbathing. And on the other side, another example of how we didn't win the war all by ourselves. We got help from our allies. This is the Navy gunboat Spry, which actually is a former Royal Navy corvette, one of 10 such vessels that were transferred on reverse lend-lease to the US Navy in 1942 to help fight the submarines on the East Coast. Interesting contrast. Her Royal Navy name was Hibiscus, and then our Navy changed the name to Spry. Now back to Schbig to review. Travel to and from Schbig was both restricted to these narrow boat lanes that we saw earlier, and particularly by the fixed barrier between across the Deer Point Passage. The Schbig community found this very difficult, and as a result, the community, the Chandler's Cove Wharf was built, Western Landing was abandoned, and the Portland ferries started calling. inside the net at Chandler's Cove. Roy Hill, Shabiger Roy Hill supervised this this construction project. I am told by Cap Leonard that Ellis Snodgrass, who did a lot of work in the bay during the war, was the contractor. Now, the nets that disrupted travel to and from Shabig, but also were intended to protect the bay from attack, were intended to protect from attack by submarines, torpedoes, and on the surface, motor torpedo boats by installing star cutters and spike cutters at the surface that were intended to rip out the bottom of the light wooden hulls of attacking motor torpedo boats. Here is an example, it's not from Casco Bay, but of a fixed obstruction similar to what was installed on the sandbar running off Bar Point, and we can see these star cutters, as well as in the distance seeing the floats of the nets in deeper water. This photo, another from the Navy Library, is of the gate vessel in Hussey Sound with Peaks Island in the background. The gate is open. I believe this line of buoys in front is the gate pulled aside to allow passage through the gate. And in the background is the net that ran from the gate vessel to the shore. Back on Shabig, the Army's presence on Shabig was headquartered and primarily on the east end and on the Richardson property now, which is the family that Nancy Ernest comes from. Their house, which we all know from its location, its familiar location near the point, was moved back near the road. Before the war, it was a two-story house. And the purpose of that was to clear the field of fire for the guns protecting both the Little John net over on one side and on the other side, covering the Broad Sound entrance to Casco Bay to seaward. Immediately after the war started, the Army, in desperation, moved some 1900 vintage coast defense guns, two of them to this point, and one of them was mounted on this round concrete pad that you see near the point. Behind the pad, you see the control bunker that managed the employment of these guns. Later in the war, in 1943, they were replaced by modern dual-purpose anti-aircraft and anti-motor torpedo boat guns that were placed in these emplacements facing out towards Broad Sound. You can also see machine gun nests here and here that protected from invasion. This is a photo of one of those 90 millimeter guns with its crew. Again, probably late in the war. They look pretty casual and not very soldierly to my military eye. But we can see in the distance the house, the bunker, which has been, I wonder if it was wrapped with a sort of cottage structure to camouflage it. And that gun platform that we saw here seems to have a circle of sandbags to protect something in the middle. I don't know what. I'd love if anybody has any family history to share to get feedback. We do know that there were searchlights that particularly swept the area of the obstructions and net from Bar Point to Little John. This photo, another informal shot of soldiers and a 40mm gun. I speculate is one of the two 40mm guns that were installed at Bar Point to protect that net on the Little John Passage. In addition to these two sites, there was a site on Deer Point with a machine gun nest that covered the net across to Long Island, and at what's now the ball field near the school and the rec center, there were two anti-aircraft searchlights. Post-war, the Richardsons recovered their property and their house and discovered that the first floor had been destroyed by being used because the summer cottage had been used year-round, and the boiler had rotted out the first floor. So they decided to abandon the first floor and move the second floor back to the original, close to the original location. This shows that move in progress. There were a handful of young Shabig men who worked on this project, and I suspect that the guy with the hat here is Ellis Snodgrass, who obviously has a supervisory air to him. In the background, you can see the concrete core of that command bunker, which the Richardsons decided to convert into a garage and storage area, considering the trouble involved with trying to demolish this massive concrete. There's one more obscure but very important war effort in Casco Bay, which occurred between the 1st of July and the middle of August in 1945. This was a Composite Task Force 69, which was a very intensive effort involving about a dozen ships and 2 squadrons of airplanes that made a crash effort to devise effective defenses against kamikaze attacks. They were focused on the challenge of invading the Japanese islands in the fall of 45. So they worked on guns, shells, tactics, anything that might work to improve, to enhance the protection of the fleet, our ships, from kamikazes. The ships that were in Casco Bay doing this ranged from the 1912 vintage battleship Wyoming, which had transitioned from being an anti-aircraft training vessel to an experimental ship with the latest fire control and gunfire, gun emplacements, to the absolutely brand new landing ship medium that was converted from a landing ship to a radar warning ship with the installation of a Navy, an Army search radar. The takeaways that I hope you will carry with you from this lecture are as follows. Casco Bay in World War II provided key support for the Battle of the Atlantic. The Navy's administration and training of convoy escorts, the shipyards which built freighters. It also transformed the Shebig community in both physical, social, and cultural ways. I hope that what I've presented tonight will enhance your experience of place through a little more knowledge of the history of the Bay. Thank you, and now let's try to do some questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I hope that click to exit presentation. Here we go. Got 24 people. Great.
Yeah.
Um,
Thank you, Erno. What I'd like to do is ask anybody who has a question to raise their hand. They can raise their hand down at the bottom under, where is it? Raise hand.
Reactions.
Oh, yeah. That's,
reactions.
yeah, they hit it on me, and Mary was good enough to mention that. So under reactions, please do raise your hand if you have a question or a comment. I can start it off by saying a little known fact is that the Cousins Island Bridge is named in memory of Ellis Snodgrass. There was a sign there years and years ago, but it's gone. But every time we go across that bridge, we can think about Ellis Snodgrass and his contribution to the community. The other thing I wanted to mention,
another anecdote. A good friend of mine, Dick Ingalls from South Portland, was in the same marine construction business. He started just as Ellis was reaching retirement. He said he was short and feisty. He always drove a brand new Cadillac, but as often as not, he'd drive up in this Cadillac and he'd open the back door and there'd be a 2-inch gasoline powered water pump in the back seat. There's your anecdote.
that's great. Yeah, I also wanted to mention that after my parents passed, I was clearing things out, and I had adopted a more or less scorched earth policy. And the thing that I really regret is that I threw away their passports that they used to go to Portland. Everybody had to have a passport. I think Erno mentioned it, and I got rid of those. I shouldn't have, but it was emblematic of what was needed just to go to Portland during the war years. So I'm looking at the participant list, and I'm waiting for people to raise their hands as reactions on the bottom. You can click on that and raise your hand, and I will take you off mute and recognize you, and you can ask questions, make comments, what have you. Erno, I think you gave such a great presentation. You left no stone unturned and no questions unanswered. Oh, there's Mally. Okay.
Oh, I see a hand.
Yes, I see.
Mally has her hand up.
Okay, so now I'll ask you, Mally, to unmute and you may speak.
Hi there. This is a story that I've been told about the Richardson property. And I can't verify that it's true, but maybe if I tell it, someone else will be able to find out. But what I've been told is that after the war, Nancy's father went to Washington to the Navy office and said, I would like to have my house back. And they said, no, we're terribly sorry. We paid you for that house and it now belongs to the US government. And he took a check out of his pocket and said, but I never cashed the check. It is still my house. And that's why the Ernests still have that property. Now, I don't know how I know that story, and I can't give you my source, which is not very good in a historical presentation, but it's such a great story. I hope it's true.
Well, and there are more of those stories around the Bay and we've got to ask Nancy and her family. And it would have been the Army because it was Army property. It was an Army installation. But the Navy expropriated Little Shebig Island, which had about a dozen summer cottages on it. And those people weren't happy. And there's a funny story, which anybody who's been in the, particularly in the sea services, would appreciate. The Pritchett Cottage, which is at the northernmost, when you walk over on the sandbar, it's the first cottage you come to, you sort of jog around it. It was the newest cottage on Little Shebig, and it was an outlier. And a relative of the family who owned it, went to the Navy office in Portland and said, here's my deed. I have the right to go back and forth to the dock and to maintain a beach cabana at the beach. And at the time, they were negotiating with the majority owner of the island, who had other property but didn't own all of it. And when I was in the National Archives in Boston, I found this wonderful letter relating this story to the Navy property officer in New York or someplace. And he said, we were told this, and the US attorney advises that we buy up the whole island. And the reason was that, said, civilians wandering around may be struck with stray baseballs for the sailors' ball games. Well, I was in the service, and the subtext, obvious to any veteran, is they didn't want the sailors ogling the girls and harassing the women. So just buy it up and get them all off. And they did not get their property back. The government decided to just sell Little Shebig as an entirety, which is why it is now a state park.
Yes. Oh, okay.
Jackie Trask.
Jackie has her hand up. Yes, please, Jackie. Hang on a
You need
second.
to unmute.
Yep, I'm working on that. Okay,
There we go.
Erno, I wonder if you have heard the story about my father's brother, Sid, and I believe it was his two sons, perhaps, who went fishing during the war and never returned.
Right.
And of course, Donna can weigh in because I don't remember exactly which year it was, but there was some speculation that they went out by Portland Head, maybe where they weren't supposed to be, and perhaps their fishing boat blew up. Have you heard that story?
I have heard the story. I have not heard about being blown up. If I had my off the cuff guess is that there was a lot of traffic out there and a lot of people didn't have their lights on and they were probably likely run down.
Yes. I think that's another theory.
And there were a lot of people out there that hadn't been doing much boating either. After, a lot of inexperienced people that were doing their best, but not
Right, I
accustomed to it.
believe that may have been New Year's Eve, but I don't recall which year.
I think it was, and I think it was early in the war. So wartime has an awful lot of odd little things happening.
Carter wants to.
Carter, do you want
to
to
say something?
say something? I will. Okay, I've
No.
Unmute yourself and you may speak.
Are you, I'm sorry, are you calling me?
Yes.
This is Avis. No, am
I
I
thought I saw
talking?
Carter White with his hand up. Maybe he was adjusting his screen.
Okay.
I did want to mention there's another story, whether it's true or not, about a German U-boat that was sunk in Casco Bay or near Casco Bay, not sure, but in the pockets of one of the drowned sailors, they found tickets to the State Theater in Portland. Again, I don't know whether that's a myth or a true story, but it indicates a possible incursion actually onto the mainland.
Well, actually, the 1944 landing down in Hancock Point, there were two German saboteurs / spies that were landed from a submarine, and the U-boat sailor who rowed them ashore emigrated to the United States and spent years dining out on his war stories in Hancock Point after World War II.
Is he the source of that myth?
Actually, it's a book, a history book of Hancock Point.
Erno, the question I had was, are there any logs from the submarines that what made the so interesting about the Eric Larson's book on the sinking of the Lusitania was the logbook of the ship that actually, the U-boat that sank it. And I was wondering if we've covered any U-boat logs of encroachment on the bay.
Not that that I have found. I don't speak German. I haven't been to the German archives. There is a lot of work has been done around U-boats in World War II, but nothing has bubbled up, to my knowledge, related to Casco Bay. Do we have a hand up from Paul?
Well, Avis, Paul's wife.
Okay.
Are you on, am I unmuted?
Yes. Yep.
I just wanted to comment on Mally's story about Dick Richardson.
Mhm.
Actually, Dick Richardson and I share a family connection in Louisiana, and we had wonderful long conversations when we first moved to the island with Evelyn and Bill Hodge in the 60s. And he told me about having to buy back his his house, but it wasn't Nancy's father who had who had to go and say, this is my house. It was her grandfather. It was Dick Richardson, not Mr. Brown.
Okay. I got that down. I'll follow it up.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Research.
Yeah,
very
my
good.
understanding is that it
Okay.
wasn't a buyback. It's that he had never cashed the check. And that was his reason for thinking that it still belonged to him.
I was just correcting who it was who did this. It
Right.
wasn't.
Yeah, no, that
It
makes
was
sense.
her
It would be
grandfather.
her grandfather.
It was Dick.
Yeah.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense.
There was some story about one of the Little Shebig property owners, cottage owners, went in to try and reason with the Navy guy. And I think he was in the guy's cottage on Little Shebig. And he's standing in front of the Navy officer's desk. And for some reason, the Navy officer was distracted and left for a moment. And he saw a paperweight on the desk that he recognized as his. And he put it in his pocket and got some small revenge.
That's good.
I remember talking to, I'd have to go back, but there's somebody on Shebig that is related to the someone who owned a cottage on Little Shebig. And I had a conversation, it was 10 years ago, but it was sort of like Kosovo. I mean, the pain of the expropriation was very alive with this person.
Mary, do you have any, wait a minute, Paul, you have a?
Paul.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I had a question, not so much on Shebig, but on Jewel Island, where years ago, we would climb up the watchtowers, which were still standing. I don't know if they're still standing today.
They're still there. Go ahead.
And so I was just curious, it took us a while to get into your program because we had trouble with Zoom. I don't know whether you mentioned the towers on the surrounding islands.
I mentioned them in passing. I've left out 99.5% of what I have learned over the years to try and keep this within a reasonable length and a reasonable focus on Shebig Island.
And
But
Mally, you can unmute yourself and
she is. Put
There's
your hand
Paul.
down.
yeah, that we can do. Go ahead, Mally.
It's actually Jim.
Oops,
I've got
Jim.
two comments. One is, I guess I wasn't aware that the Italians changed sides during the war. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. And the other one that struck my interest was the cooperation between the Army and the Navy. How did that work out? Is that something that's still persists today? But it seems to me two huge bureaucracies. Again, I'm not used to cooperation between large entities.
So on the first question, the Italians left the Axis in September of '43 and hoped that they could get rid of the Germans, and the Germans got the drop on them and took over Italy very, very quickly. The agreement was that the Italian Navy would, if they could, leave their ports and come to Allied harbors. Understandably, that was most successful with the submarines because they could hide. there were two modern battleships that, and to your point of cooperation, tried to leave Italy and were sunk by the Germans because the Italian Air Force wasn't providing them air cover. But they did, there was an Italian co-belligerent army that fought with the Allies after September 43. And the submarines and some of the other, it's easy to go down rat holes. I've only focused on the part that's relevant to Casco Bay. The question about Army-Navy cooperation, it was imposed, and there's a very interesting summary of the experience of the Harbor Entrance Control Post that makes the point that there was great cooperation between the Army and Navy, particularly early in the war when everybody was living in the same barracks. Late in the war, particularly the duty officers, and late in the war, things got relaxed and officers could bring their families and they weren't committed in the same way. And the Navy commander, who was the guy with the binoculars in the picture, wrote the history. And one of his complaints was, we could never convince the Army that they shouldn't fire close to ships. And the comment was, the Army found it amusing. The merchant people, merchant mariners on the ships were petrified, obviously. And if there was a shell that landed anywhere close to them, they'd stop. And the Army thought that was hilarious. But, and they never got anywhere in sort of developing successfully really developing a common vision. But they got through the war, and there were no great disasters. Thank God.
Excellent. Any other questions, comments from anybody here tonight? This is
Thank you for the great stories.
yes. This has been remarkable. It's wonderful to hear stories and look around and see what it was like 50, 60 years ago. Mary, do you have any closing comments from anybody? Or from you?
Yes.
I am going to mute myself so that Mary
That's
can.
Right.
I'm muted.
We're a team here.
Over to you.
So I'd like to thank you all for tuning in on this summer evening, and want to note that our next lecture will feature Linda Grant of the Golf Club. I believe she'll be celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Golf Club with us, and she's prepared quite a presentation. And at this point, I cannot tell you if it's going to continue to be a Zoom or if it's going to be in person. We really don't know that, but we will keep you all informed as time passes. David, do you have the exact date of our
I do-
next lecture?
I
It
do
would be
not.
4 weeks from today.
Yeah,
Let me
I
go
do
to
not. I would urge everybody to stay
our
tuned to the various websites.
You can find it on the website.
Yes, you
Especially-
can find it on the website. I'm a little embarrassed. I didn't think of,
At my age, I'd
Remembering
forget before then, long before.
so go to shabighistory.com and you'll find out when that presentation with Linda Grant will be. It'll be a Monday night, probably somewhere around 4 weeks away.
And
So
in August.
Yes.
either Mally or Jim, not sure who, did say to
I
everyone,
can't hear you,
really,
David.
says, really excellent. Thank you, Mary,
David.
David, especially Erno. You say you
August
you
9.
can't see me?
August 9th.
Ah, okay.
John says it's August 9th.
August 9th. it is.
David, we can't hear you.
I don't understand why. I'm not muted. Huh. I
Is
don't
it
know.
just us?
I hear you,
I
David.
can hear David.
All right. Okay, good. Well, it's a good time to say
All
good.
right, well, thank you all. We won't keep you any longer. And good night. We'll see you August 9th for our next lecture.
Good night, everyone.